Hello, Kyani, and welcome to the Wednesday webinar. My name is Andrew Mangeris, the Chief Products Officer here at Kyani, and I will be your host today on our webinar. I'm excited to be here and to be able to talk a little bit about in-depth on nitric oxide. So we're glad to be here this evening. Every Wednesday, we host our webinar here at 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. So we'd like to welcome you. Sometimes we will do training, and sometimes we will get into business training. Sometimes we'll get into product training more in depth. So first, let's go through our disclaimer here. These statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease or condition. And the clinical studies, which we will go through in this presentation, address the impact of nitric oxide generally and not any Kyani product specifically. And of course, this is a presentation for educational purposes only. We want you to be more educated and have a better understanding of what some of the science is out there. And let's go ahead and start off with a quote from Dr. Mercola. He said, "Few scientific discoveries can match the importance of nitric oxide." And true that is. Nitric oxide is one of the most important discoveries in the nutritional supplement world in the past, I would say 30, 40 years, probably back since vitamin C. It is so key in so many different areas, as we're going to learn as we go throughout this presentation. But a little bit of background. Nitric oxide, the discovery of it, won a Nobel Prize in medicine in 1998. And as you can see here, to date, there are over 160,000 studies that have been done on nitric oxide. And so you can see here how amazing it is right here. You can, just looking at pubmed.gov, where you can look up all the published research that is out there, but 162 actually as of the date of this recording. So pretty impressive. I just pulled this up today, and you can see how often it is referenced throughout scientific studies and how important it's become. And that is just in the past 25 years or so that we've seen this huge onslaught of research coming into nitric oxide, because it's a communication molecule. It is often called the molecule of life. It modulates a lot of your arterioles and veins and any of the arterial walls, the endothelial cells that you have, as far as their dilation, the vasodilation that goes on with those. So just so key in so many different areas. And as we'll learn here too, there's a lot of studies done on its ability to communicate in your nerves, and communicating from pain to other sensories and getting into the brain and so forth. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the nitric oxide pathway. Now, a lot of people understand, well, now I'm taking nitrates, but it helps with my nitric oxide. How does that actually happen? And so you see here, NO3 is your nitrates, and then it goes into a nitrite. It gets reduced there, and then a nitric oxide. And that first step actually happens by oral bacteria, and they are key into reducing the nitrates into nitrites. And so that's one of the very first steps that happens, and that's why a lot of times we talk about putting it in your mouth and actually swishing it in your mouth to help that conversion process take place with that good bacteria in the oral cavity. And then what happens is your stomach acid, that high acidity, also is responsible for converting them into nitric oxide. And so then that is what is considered one of the quickest pathways to get to nitric oxide. And a lot of people talk about other pathways, like a arginine pathway, which is also a valid pathway, but it takes longer because that actually has to go down into the lower intestines, get absorbed, and then get converted through nitric oxide synthase in the system, in the body. But when you're talking about a quick pathway, and that's one of the reasons why people notice results in 5-10 minutes when they take dietary nitrates. And so this is the actual pathway. Now, a lot of people say, well, nitrates are bad. I hear, they use nitrates in processed foods, meats particularly, and I hear about how they're bad for you. Let's talk a little bit about what that means. So nitrates turn to nitrites, but they can also convert into nitrosamine. Now, nitrosamine is known to be a carcinogen, and people don't want that, and that's why they think that they're bad. But let's talk about what the pathway is for that to happen. Your oral bacteria actually will convert it into nitrites, and then you have the presence of protein, heme, and heat. And these occur in processed meats. And so when you have that, you have a lot of the iron there, which is responsible for a lot of your red blood cells, as well as the protein there in processed meats. And heat, so cooking those processed meats can also increase that level. And so the people, so you'll get that conversion from nitrites to nitrosamines, which does not happen when you have plant-based. When you have plant-based nitrates, you don't have the presence of that protein, heme, or even the heat. And so you're not going to have the concern about converting into nitrosamines. So are nitrates bad for you? Well, in certain instances, they could be potentially bad. But when you're talking about plant-based nitrates, like from a noni plant, you're not going to have the concern about converting into nitrosamine. So let's get into some of the benefits here. These are some of the structure function statements with nitric oxide. It helps support cardiovascular health. It supports healthy inflammation response, supports cognitive function, promotes healthy immune response, supports nutrient absorption. And let's go through and show some studies that have been done on each of these areas. Specifically, we'll start with cardiovascular health. And these are some of the studies that you can actually just pull up on pubmed.gov, and you can go there and take a look at a lot of different studies. I pulled up some of the ones that looked most relevant to what people might be interested in and as well as the benefits that you might get supporting the structure function statement. Dietary nitrates, nitric oxide, cardiovascular health. This is a scientific journal that published it, talking about how you get cardiovascular health from dietary nitrates, referring to the plant nitrates mainly, and then being converted into nitric oxide. Nitric oxide in the cardiovascular system. What are some of the scientific journal talks about what some of the benefits are on the cardiovascular system by nitric oxide, because we know there's a lot of benefits to it. This next one talks about going beyond the endothelium. One of the things we understand is when we have the cells around the circulatory system or arterial walls there, the endothelium is responsible for releasing the production of nitric oxide. And so they're looking at what else can it do on this one. Targeting nitric oxide in the natural derived compounds as a therapeutic strategy in vascular disease. So, we know that one of the biggest concerns today is vascular disease, and it takes the lives of so many different people. And so they're studying here in this study to find out how there are some therapeutic strategies with it. Nitric oxide has a protective role in the cardiovascular system. So what is it doing to protect our cardiovascular system? And this study actually gets into some of that. And then acute ingestion of dietary nitrates. Dietary nitrates just typically means your plant-based source of nitrates. And in talking about muscle blood flow and how you actually increase the blood flow in your muscles with an increase of dietary nitrates. So let's look at some of the inflammation response here. Nitric oxide and superoxide in inflammation and immune. Well, we know that inflammation and immune systems are very closely tied. So they work together frequently, because when you have an injury, you're going to have both of these responses. The immune system is going to respond, as well as you're going to have an inflammatory response. And so the study of nitric oxide, as well as the antioxidant superoxide dismutase in that response, and how those two affect it. In the next one here, we've got hydrogen sulfide nitric oxide interactions in inflammation. How does it interact? Nitric oxide in immunity and inflammation, again, targeting both of these. The next one here is talking about periodontal disease. One of the things we understand about periodontal disease is there's lots of inflammation in the gums, and being able to target that. And I would think dietary nitrates there right in the mouth and taking them in the mouth would be a benefit to that. And then also as a signaling molecule. So you have signaling molecules in the inflammation response. And how does nitric oxide act as a signaling molecule in that? So as you can see here, some other studies on inflammation and the importance of it. Now let's look at a study that was done on dietary nitrates and comparing it to the amount of nitric oxide that's released compared to morphine. And you can see here morphine and dietary nitrates. We know that nitric oxide has been studied because it's when you're looking at pain and association with pain, but how it is utilized, and it's not completely understood, but we do know that releasing more nitric oxide happens around pain and is beneficial. And you can see it compared to the control group right here, a huge increase in nitric oxide and very closely related to the levels of morphine. And this was done in human aortic endothelial cells. Let's take a look here about cognitive function. Cognitive function, talking into the brain and the importance of it in the brain. Endothelial nitric oxide, it's a protector of a healthy mind. So how is it protecting the mind, and why is it beneficial to protect the mind? And then modulating brain function. Next study getting into the modulation of brain function and how it helps it. And nitric oxide is important for our brain. Why is that? This scientific journal goes into detail about why it is important for our brain support. The hippocampus, which is a key area in the brain, and nitric oxide, and how nitric oxide actually showed some improved performance in the hippocampus area of the brain. Cerebral vascular regulation. So what does nitric oxide do in the brain? And as far as also concerning nitric oxide getting into the brain, there's some studies that have been done on that. The last one down there talks exactly about that, the perfusion of nitric oxide getting into the brain, and how does that pass through the blood-brain barrier. Let's look at a couple of the quotes here from one of the studies. This was a study in a scientific journal, Current Pain and Headache Report. The role of nitric oxide in cluster headaches. So we know that people get cluster headaches where they have repeat headaches just constantly coming back. And nitric oxide regulates vascular tone and acts as a potent vasodilator. Vasodilator meaning, opens up and helps increase blood flow, and thus participates in regulating blood flow. Nitric oxide is also considered to play a role in processing sensory information and pain sensitization. So key there in pain and sensories, and the role that nitric oxide can help play in that. A lot of people have heard of anecdotal reports on headaches and consumption of nitrates. And so this study actually goes into, well, what are some of the reasons and why people may have some benefits to dietary nitrates in their consumption as it relates to headaches. Next, we want to get into immune system. A healthy cell is extremely important. And of course, the correlation between immune system and your inflammatory response we talked about earlier. But here are some different studies that have been done in talking about the immune system and nitric oxide. One here on melanoma. Of course, your body's response to cancer cells or skin cancer cells, melanoma, and how nitric oxide plays a role in that. And then if we come down, nitric oxide and the immune response, talking about how it helps with immune response. But this last one here is really interesting: nitric oxide and macrophage function. A macrophage is an immune cell in the body that is non-specific, and it will target any non-self cells. And so macrophages can be responsible for removing bacteria, viruses, cancer cells, all types of cells that are foreign to the body, and it'll recognize them and destroy them. And this actually talks about how it does that in a sense of it uses nitric oxide. So let's go into one of the quotes from one of the studies here, the Scientific Journal of Nature Immunology Journal. Nitric oxide is involved in the pathogenesis and control of infectious diseases, tumors, autoimmune processes, and chronic degenerative diseases. Pretty bold statement there about how nitric oxide is involved. And again, taking us back to why this molecule is considered the molecule of life, because it does so much in the body, things that we don't even understand yet. This next journal, the Annual Review of Immunology, comes back to the macrophages. Sustained production of nitric oxide endows macrophages with cytostatic or cytotoxic activity against viruses, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, helminths, and tumor cells. So these macrophages actually utilize nitric oxide as part of their normal process to kill and destroy viruses, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, tumor cells. I mean, that's a powerful statement right there. Your body already needs these. And so a lot of times we talk about having to have more nitric oxide, but we don't understand that we're actually supporting our current immune system and their macrophages by having increased levels of nitric oxide in that normal immune function. Let's look at flu vaccines. The flu vaccine, many people get it on a yearly, annual basis to help prevent them. Look at the effectiveness of the flu vaccine. It has gone down incredibly over the past 10 years. And you can see that it's becoming extremely ineffective. Now, I'm not advocating you do or don't go get your flu vaccine. Some protection might be better than no protection. But what I am looking at is something's going on with us and our ability to be able to protect ourselves. And one of the key points of nitric oxide is that its ability to kill the different viruses. We saw that with that last study. Here's another study, nitric oxide in influenza. It inhibits influenza virus replication. So nitric oxide has been key to showing how it will be able to destroy that virus. So just make sure that you're taking your extra dietary nitrates to help protect you if you think you might be getting the flu. That's what I learned from this anyway. We don't know for sure that it's going to be killing the flu virus directly, but I sure want to make sure that my nitric oxide levels are as supported as they can be. So, all right, let's take a look at nitric oxide and absorption. Studies talk about how it helps improve absorption. One of the mechanisms that it does that is through blood flow. And here we go, hemodynamic effects of nitroglycerin and long-acting nitrates. This one here, the third one down, mesenteric blood flow, and I'll show a diagram of this on the next chart, but it gets into the importance of blood flow around the small intestines. We know that's where things get absorbed, and so we know that that's where you're going to have the most absorption of any of the nutrients you're trying to get into the body is right around the small intestines. And so that is key to it. Now, the one after that, role of nitric oxide in intestinal water and electrolyte transport. It talks about how you're going to have that communication molecule and how nitric oxide is responsible for helping that transport of water and electrolytes and other nutrients across those microvilli in the small intestines. pretty important here when we're talking about improving our absorption. So one of the easiest ways to improve the absorption or improve the efficacy of other nutrients is by increasing our dietary nitrate supplementation. And then actually let's go ahead and go to this next chart here that actually shows the mesenteric blood flow compared to a control group. Nitric oxide group 1 had 100% increase of blood flow into the digestive area around your small intestines. Very important, again, in order to make sure that you're going to get those nutrients absorbed. The number 2, group 2 here, had 170% increase, an incredible amount of increase in blood flow. And so if you want to make sure that you're going to be absorbing those key nutrients, make sure that you are taking those dietary nitrates. Well, we've just touched basically on some of the importance in the studies of nitric oxide. I want to thank you guys for joining me here today. We will have this posted to our YouTube playlist under the Wednesday webinar. And also to remind you that we have our kickoff call Saturday, 10 a.m. with Kirk Hansen. Don't forget to attend that. And we will see you next week on our Wednesday webinar. Thank you for joining us. My name is Andrew Mangeris, and I live Kyani.